So we were going to talk about mannerism, which is a style that begins sort of right after the High Renaissance style. And often art historians see beginnings of the style of mannerism in the art of Raphael and the art of the great masters of the High Renaissance. Raphael and Michelangelo, we sort of get the glimmerings of a new style that we call mannerism.
That's an important point to remember, because sometimes there's a tendency to think of radical shifts in style when in fact there's a lot of continuity, and as you said, the roots of mannerism are already evident in the work of High Renaissance artists like Raphael. Like in this particular example, which is a detail from the center of his large fresco in the Vatican apartments, the Vatican Stanze. This is the fresco, the Fire in the Borgo, that was painted for Pope Leo X between around 1514 and 1517.
So you think we can see the beginnings of a Mannerist style in this painting?
There are several reasons why this is sometimes indicated as a seed of Mannerism, if you want to think of it that way, because some of the stylistic characteristics that we see in Mannerism are already evident here. For instance, one thing that we'll talk about a lot is the very elongated figure, proportions that no longer correspond to the classical ratios of about 8 heads that we're used to seeing in the High Renaissance. Instead, we get figures like this man hanging from the wall, who is exceptionally elongated. What else do we see that's similar, or that reminds us of the Mannerist style? Well, for instance, the main subject of the scene is here, the Pope in the background. Leo III, the historical Pope, appeared in the window of the Vatican and put out the fire that was in the Borgo, in the neighborhood around the Vatican, simply by raising his hand and making a gesture of blessing.
A miracle.
This is the miracle that's being represented. And what's strange is, usually in the High Renaissance, the artists like to put their subject matter front and center. Very clear, very straightforward, easy to understand.
If you think about Raphael's own fresco of the School of Athens, for example, with Plato and Aristotle right there in the center.
Like the School of Athens, like the Last Supper, exactly. Here, the main subject matter is far, far in the distance, and all of these other things around the outside seem to be the main focus of the scene, and so what we get is a kind of subordination of the main subject. You have to search and hunt. It's almost like the picture is a puzzle that you need to solve, and we're going to see that that is also a general aspect of Mannerist art.
Another thing that I see here that reminds me of Mannerism is the sort of over-drama of the figures themselves in the foreground, this figure raising her arms. There's a kind of, in a way, sometimes it seems to me a kind of overacting in Mannerism.
There's an overacting, and at the same time, what's interesting is that even though it's something that's very dramatic and potentially violent, at the same time, there is a sense of elegance and gracefulness in the figures. And it's that combination of drama and elegance that's generally characteristic of Mannerism.
So let's take a good look at a painting that really has both of those qualities.
Okay.
This is Pontormo's painting of the Entombment.
That's right. Generally, this is thought of as being an entombment, and what we see represented is the Virgin Mary in blue, who is being consoled by the people around her. And then here is the figure of Christ, who is being supported by the two figures underneath him, and they are carrying him away from the Virgin Mary in this direction. And so the idea is that this is the scene that immediately follows something like the Pietà or the Lamentation, where Christ is lying on his mother's lap. This is the scene immediately after that, when Christ is being carried away in this direction towards the tomb, and so we call this an entombment.
And it's a painting that just screams to me that it's not a Renaissance painting anymore, because for so many reasons. I mean, most obviously, I guess, to me, is the fact that all the figures are compressed into the foreground, and that whole Renaissance interest in an illusion of space created by atmospheric and linear perspective, and having a foreground and a middle ground and a background. You know, everything seems compressed into about 3 feet here.
Exactly. There's no rational sense of space. There's no rational sense of depth. The kinds of things that we're used to seeing in High Renaissance art, where its emphasis is on logic and legibility, those things seem to have been discarded. Additionally, there's a lot of ambiguity and things that are sort of illogical. Like, for instance, if this is the body of Christ, who is a dead 33-year-old man, how is it possible that the two figures underneath him are supporting him simply by standing on their tiptoes as if he's completely weightless? This is so ambiguous that some scholars have even suggested that these are angels who are actually lifting Christ up into heaven rather than carrying him away from the Virgin Mary.
Yeah, and the expressions on their faces also don't indicate that they're, straining themselves in any way.
Exactly. And like you said, there's this sense of drama and the hand gestures, but there's also this sense of incredible elegance. Again, we can see the very, very elongated figures, like the figure of that figure who's carrying Christ underneath his arms, the other ones in the background. Even the figure of Christ is this elongated, elegant, S-shaped curve. And so what we're seeing is that the clarity of the subject matter, the drama of the narrative, as it's told in the text of the Bible, is being subordinated to an emphasis on an illogical sophistication, a sense of ambiguity, and a sense of gracefulness. And it's this that is becoming standard in Mannerism, and some people point to this painting as one of the first real Mannerist paintings of the period. Something else I'd like to point out that's kind of illogical is the light source. This is something else that high Renaissance artists paid a lot of attention to and tried to make...
Beginning with Boccaccio, really.
Exactly. They tried to make it look very logical, and here we see some ambiguity in the sense that is the light coming from the left, where it's lighting up the back of this figure's tunic, or is it actually coming from the right, where the tunic also seems to be lit up, but in a completely different color, which again is kind of confusing and strange.
The colors are strange.
The colors are very strange, and again, what it contributes to is a sense of the image being very pretty, because you have these light colors, these pastel, candy colors, that add to that sense of prettiness, which is sort of not in accordance with the subject matter.
Right. I've always been fascinated by this figure in particular, whose sort of body really doesn't seem to make sense. We seem to have a kind of frontal view of this figure's calf, and yet the figure seems to be twisting if you look at the other leg. And also, what always seemed odd to me and very different from the High Renaissance is that the way that this composition has, in a way, nothing in its center. Where a High Renaissance painting like Leonardo's Last Supper or Raphael's School of Athens would have the most important figures in the center. Here we have a composition not based on a pyramid, which is the normal shape for a composition in the High Renaissance, which is very stable, which leads your eye to the top of the pyramid. But here a composition in the shape of a circle where our eye just kind of goes around and never rests
really
anywhere.
Something else I'd like to point out that's a little odd is we see the back of a woman's head here. She's the figure who's supporting Christ's hands, but we don't see her legs. There's no clear indication of where she's standing. And in fact, when you look at it, sometimes there could be some ambiguity that would lead you to think that these hands holding the hand of Christ actually belong to this person way up here, which would give that person incredibly long, strange arms. A similar illusion is created by this figure dressed in green, because we see at the bottom all of this green fabric, which almost looks like it could belong to the figure way up here, but of course that wouldn't make any sense
at
all.
And how is that figure up there? I mean, we don't see a ladder. There's no rational explanation for why that figure is back up here,
Yeah, absolutely. Once again, everything is subordinated to a sense of elegance and sophistication, and that's maybe even where the term Mannerism comes from, because the Italian word maniera means style. And so one way to think of Mannerism is that it is the stylish style. In other words, it is the style about being stylish, about being elegant, about being fashionable, and about the artist showing off his technical skill. If we look at a detail, we can see here, for instance, that it's not that Pontormo didn't know how to represent things accurately or skillfully. Look at the hands, for instance, next to Christ's body. The draftsmanship there is quite exceptional, but what he's doing is he's showing off his draftsmanship, he's showing off his ability to be elegant, and the more complicated and engaging the image was, even to the point of enigma and confusion, the more successful it was as a Mannerist image.
And so one idea about why Mannerism happens in this way or develops into the kind of style that it is that the artists of the High Renaissance had sort of taken that naturalism of the High Renaissance as far as it was going to be able to go. And that they needed to be able to do something different, and that they had, during the High Renaissance, artists had achieved such an amazing level with their technical skill in representing reality that it now became interesting to show off that skill.
Absolutely, and that there was a sense that all of the possibilities in the High Renaissance, naturalism, legibility, balance, those things had already been worked out to their fullest, and so the newer generation of artists, like Pontormo, they needed to go in another direction. And that point that you raise about the High Renaissance is a good opportunity to compare this Entombment to one actually by Raphael. Here's Raphael's Entombment. This is a typical high Renaissance image because look, for instance, at how the figures actually visibly strain under the weight of the dead body of Christ. Look at how the emotions are very, very clearly depicted, especially the Virgin Mary who's fainted here. Look at how the sense of depth and space is represented so rationally and clearly, where you can see into the landscape, into the distance. There's atmospheric perspective. The figures are to scale depending on where they're positioned. The story is told clearly because we even see the crosses in the background, even with the ladder that was used to lower Christ's body. There's a tremendous sense of clarity.
The story is clearly told, absolutely.
Everything corresponds to the text and to the message that's trying to be communicated.
And even the way that the figures are arranged here, everyone has their, there's this focus compositionally, even if they're not looking at Christ, there's a focus on Christ.
Absolutely.